Good evening. I'm Joe Nye, the Dean of the Kennedy School, and it's a pleasure to welcome you and to welcome our guests this evening to the Kennedy School Forum. I'm going to ask Dan Glickman to introduce Bill Cohen because they were fellow cabinet secretaries together, and I will spend my time introducing Dan. But I should say before I do that, I had the pleasure of a round-the-world trip with Bill Cohen when he was a senator from Maine, and discovered that he was not only a distinguished senator, but was a great poet and novelist. So those of you who listen to him tonight will hear all about public policy, but I think it's only right that you, after this, go and look up his books in the fiction and poetry category and enjoy them as much as I did. But the real purpose for me this evening is to introduce to you, if you haven't yet met him, and to welcome to the Kennedy School our new director of the Institute of Politics, Dan Glickman. Dan has a distinguished record of public service himself, as Secretary of Agriculture most recently for nearly 6 years, and before that 18 years in the House of Representatives representing Kansas, and he has very distinguished service on a number of committees. I was particularly impressed by his work, not just on the Judiciary Committee, but as chairman of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. We are just delighted to have him follow in the footsteps of people like David Pryor and Alan Simpson as the director of the Institute of Politics, because we know that he is going to bring to it that same energy and enthusiasm that has been typical of the past, only more so. So please join me in welcoming Dan Glickman to introduce our guest this evening.
Thank you. Thank you, Dean Nye, and thank you, Bill Cohen, for coming here. And on behalf of the students and the faculty and the staff of Harvard University, we want to welcome not only a former fellow of the Institute of Politics, but also a former congressman, a former senator, and a former and prestigious Secretary of Defense. Since its creation by the Kennedy family in 1966, the Institute of Politics has served as a living memorial to President John F. Kennedy, seeking to inspire young people to careers in government and public service. Our mission here at the Institute of Politics is to inspire students of conviction and courage to enter the challenging world of public service. And for those of you studying politics and political science, I think you should take heart, because tonight you will hear no better retort to that common refrain that government is not the answer, because sometimes it is. Sometimes government and government employees are exactly what we need. When the planes struck the Twin Towers in New York and the Pentagon in Washington, while thousands fled, we saw government workers and public service employees rushing in to help. Whether it's the men and women in our police and fire departments or federal, state, and local government employees, public service matters. It is the sacrifices made by the public service employees on 9/11 that allowed all of us to measure ourselves as we traverse through these challenging times. Public service, while noble, now has a renewed purpose and mission that had been forgotten for many years. When you review the life and times of William S. Cohen, you see an American journey, that much can be achieved through dedication and public service. The son of a Russian Jewish immigrant, Bill Cohen has degrees from Bowdoin College and Boston University Law School. His first foray into public service was as city councilor in Bangor, Maine, and later as mayor of Bangor. Elected to the U.S. House in 1972 for Maine's 2nd Congressional District, he was then elected to the Senate in '78 and served through 1987. In the House and Senate, he served on two little-known congressional committees in the House and the Senate. Some of you may barely remember them: Watergate and Iran-Contra. As a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee and Vice Chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, he acquired a perspective and understanding of the international security threats around the world. More than anything, his unflappable style and personal integrity helped to mend fences and build policy clarity in an era of deepening partisan divide on Capitol Hill. During his confirmation as Secretary of Defense, Secretary Cohen, who was the only Republican in the Clinton cabinet, said, "I believe my record is one of bridging differences, not papering over them, but building reasonable and responsible compromises." As Secretary, he guided U.S. forces through campaigns in Kosovo and the Persian Gulf, extending the NATO alliance and strengthening global partnerships for fighting the war on terrorism. Today, he is chairman and CEO of the Cohen Group, a strategic business consulting firm in Washington, D.C., but probably more important than that, he has written 2 volumes on poetry, 3 novels, and I believe 4 other books as well. And it was only natural for the Christian Science Monitor to call him a true Renaissance man. He is also married to a wonderful woman, Janet Langhart Cohen, who I think certainly has inspired a lot of folks, including my wife, when we lived in Washington. So, ladies and gentlemen, let us all give a big hand to the Honorable Bill Cohen.
Dan, thank you very much. What he failed to mention is that we served together in the House, only for 2 years in the House and then the Senate and Cabinet, but he served with great distinction in both our capacities in the executive branch and the Congress, and a great Secretary of Agriculture. Dan, thank you very much. Dr. White, who was the Deputy Secretary of Defense, who is now here instructing those of you who are attending the Kennedy Institute. Ash Carter, also whom I worked with when he was serving with Bill Perry, my predecessor at the Secretary of Defense position. And a special word to Ted Sorensen. Ted, I just met a moment ago. If you're here, if you have to read books, don't read mine, read his, and read them about John F. Kennedy, perhaps one of the best books that I've read about President Kennedy. Next to that, I would recommend a book by Dr. Nye. I'm really trying to ingratiate myself here tonight. But I would point to the Paradox of American Power as one of the very slim but profound volumes. And if there's one book that I think all of us should turn to in trying to understand what America's role is and should be in the future that is rocketing at us, it would be Dr. Nye's book. He and I did have occasion to work together in the Clinton administration, and prior to that when I was in the Senate. So pleasure to be here, Dr. Nye. I wasn't sure exactly how I should begin tonight. And talking about public service and your commitment, and hopefully your commitment to public service. I was thinking about Warren G. Harding. I'm always hesitant to pluck his name out of the yellow pages of yesteryear. But Harding once said that government is, after all, a very simple thing. And this prompted a great Supreme Court justice by the name of Felix Frankfurter to say, there never was a more pathetic misapprehension of responsibility than Harding's superficial conclusion. And I think, however, that it was Ronald Reagan, when he was Governor Reagan, who had one of the more poignant definitions of government. He said, government is like a baby's alimentary canal. It has a healthy appetite at one end and very little sense of responsibility at the other. Now, I say that, it was said in jest, but government does have a healthy appetite. You can look across the spectrum from the local governments to the state governments that are now running deficits to the federal government, which is going to be running deficits. We who serve in government have very healthy appetites because people demand more and more. More and more social services, more and more safety nets, more and more desirable projects. And now more and more perhaps even security. So we have healthy appetites in democracies, and one of the real challenges to anyone who serves in public office, be it elective or appointed, in the bureaucracies. And I hate to think of how the word bureaucrat has taken on a negative connotation, because we need bureaucrats. We need people to run things, to respond to people's needs. And so over the years, I think too many elected officials have always tried to take advantage and talk about bureaucrats. Well, they're important. But I think it's now more and more important than ever that we have good people who want to come into public service to try to reconcile these conflicting needs. How do we satisfy our appetites at the same time reconcile that with a need for some sense of responsibility? And I mean fiscal responsibility as well, because otherwise, if we continue to simply spend and don't concern ourselves with deficits, then what we are doing is engaging what I used to call fiscal child abuse. We are inflicting pain and suffering and bruises and catastrophic injuries, but you don't see it. Not while you're young, until you're growing up and you have to pay the bills. And so it's something that we always have to be concerned about, exactly how do we measure serving the public while also preserving your futures and that of your children. I was going to mention Kim Dae-jung. Anyone here from South Korea? I met him on a number of occasions, but 2 years ago, I was visiting him in his summer place in South Korea. And I mention it because he's really on the way out now, so to speak, of public office, and has had rather a rocky time the last year or so. But when I met with him, I was curious about this man who had been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. What sustained him during the time that he was in prison? He was obviously a very religious man, and so he relied upon his faith. But I said, how'd you get through those troubled times? He said, I read Alvin Toffler. And I said, wow, we have a connection here, because I recall reading everything that Toffler, both Alvin and Heidi Toffler, had written. Echospasm, certainly Future Shock, Power Shift, Third Wave, War, Anti-War, all of the books. But what struck me that he would turn to Toffler in thinking about future shock and thinking about third waves and power shifts. And back in the early 70s, when I was reading about future shock, I remember how Toffler described a world in which time was going to be speeded up by events. And we were going to see this accelerated thrust into the future, in which you would see these hurricane winds of change affecting our values and our culture and our way of thinking. That technology itself was miniaturizing the globe. Think about it. Technology is shrinking the size of the globe. And if you look back, vast oceans, they're now mere ponds. Distant countries are as close as counties. All of this has been done through technology. I like to think that today the world is not much bigger than a small ball spinning on the finger of science. And it's going faster and faster and faster. And decisions have to be made. And they come at us, roaring at us with an incredible velocity. And so that's why I think it is more important than ever, because we're living in this world of future shock. What Toffler described back in the 70s, it's here. And everything is spinning faster and faster, issues coming at elected and non-elected officials to resolve faster and faster. And that's why I think this institute is so important. I think what you're doing here is so important, Dr. Nye, in terms of looking just at the numbers. And I saw where you have some 38 people, I guess, graduated last year in the Presidential Management Intern Program. Very good program. 3 of those graduates, actually, of that program are working in my office today. You have some 35 active duty officers in the degree program. You have 20 in the National Security Studies program. And you have, I saw in the most recent press release, some 63% of the students who are graduating with the Master of Public Policy degrees, they have taken jobs in government service. That's a remarkable contribution to our public welfare, our public well-being. So I wanted to be here to commend the school, the Kennedy School, for what it is doing. And I'm told you have at least 50 students from foreign countries. You will no doubt go back to your country to make important contributions to the shaping of your country's future. And again, my commendation to you. I thought I might stand here and ask 2 questions that Admiral Stockdale, how many here have ever heard of Admiral James Stockdale? You remember when he was running as Ross Perot's running mate, and he got up on a podium much like this, and he approached the cameras and he asked 2 questions. He said, who am I? And why am I here? And the same kind of ripple of laughter went through the audience, much as it is tonight. But they were very existential questions. I mean, who am I? Why am I standing here like a vice presidential candidate? Who am I to be qualified to be here? And I think these are questions, and very few people knew about him, a war hero, suffered, I think, at least 6 years or more as a prisoner of war in Vietnam, regarded by those in the Navy as a real hero and throughout our military, but very few Americans knew who he was. So he says, who am I? I think each of us, in our own ways, we ask this question virtually every day that we wake up. I mean, who are we? And what are we doing here? Here at the school, but here in life itself. And we have to ask that as a nation. We have to ask, who are we, the United States of America? Why are we here? Where are we going? What is our role? And we frequently hear the words, we are a superpower. We are the world's only superpower. What does that mean? What are the benefits of being a superpower? And what are the burdens? And are we willing to bear the burdens to what end? These are all issues that public officials need to ask ourselves, and those that we have served in the past or serve now have to constantly respond to you to answer. What is our role in the world? How do we conduct ourselves? How do we shape our policies? And the word shape brings to mind something that Dr. White and I worked on when we were at the Defense Department together. We had something called the QDR, the Quadrennial Defense Review. Every 4 years, we are required to try to peer into the future. Remember, it was Yogi Berra who said that predictions are hard, especially about the future. In the military, you have to peer into the future through an opaque window to try to look 5 and 10 and even 15 years into the future, because it takes that long to develop a system, to develop a certain type of weapon system. It takes anywhere from 12 to 15 years. So you say, what are the threats out there? What is the world likely to look like that we will have to start spending your money now to prepare to defend ourselves against? And so that was part of the shaping, responding, and preparing, the 3 words that we had to really identify what our policy was. Shaping, by having our forces, and I assume we have some military personnel here tonight, by shaping, what we said is we want to be forward deployed. We have roughly 100,000 of our people forward deployed throughout the Asia-Pacific region, 100,000 throughout the European continent, about 23,000 now in the Persian Gulf, and no doubt going up. What are they doing? They, by their very presence, they are shaping world events in ways that we hope will be advantageous to us. And I will tell you this, I couldn't be more proud of having been selected by President Clinton to serve as Secretary of Defense. When you see the people who are serving us, and you see how educated they are, how disciplined they are, how well led they are, how patriotic they are, and what kind of sacrifices they make day in and day out along with their families, you see them forward deployed, and guess what? Other countries look to us and they say, there's a country we don't want to take on. Your potential adversaries also look at us and they say, there's a country that we don't want to take on, but your supporters say, we want to be on your side. Basically, what we do is we help to shape, reinforce our allies, and we send a signal to our adversaries. Be with us and don't challenge us. And in that way, we are helping to spread stability. If you look at the Asia-Pacific region, why is it that the Singaporeans want our aircraft carriers to come? Why is it we have such a strong relationship with Japan? Why is it important that we have forces deployed? Because we help to maintain stability in a region. And what happens when you have stability? When you have stability in any region, there is investment. Companies invest their money into those regions, creating jobs, which helps generate prosperity, which helps maintain stability and hopefully democracy. In the absence of stability, what happens? First thing, money comes out. Investors pull their money out immediately, and you've got a problem. You've got a crisis in the region because people no longer have jobs, or the banks have crashed, or there is anarchy in the streets. So we help to shape the future by having our military forward deployed in ways that we are invited in. We are not conquerors as such. We're invited in by various countries. I mentioned China just in passing. I've given speeches to the Chinese military saying the last thing you should want is for the United States to ever leave the Asia-Pacific region. Why? A vacuum would be created. Who would fill it? Would Chinese military fill it? Would Japan sit idly by while Chinese military filled it? Would India or Pakistan allow it to be filled without some question? So we have a very important role to maintain stability, and that generates levels of investment and prosperity. Coming back now to the burdens and the benefits. The burdens we bear, we've got a big military budget. It's probably going to go up. And that will place pressure on other aspects of the budget, including the increasing deficit. So the question is this something that's in our national security interests and long-term interests to do? We are now engaged in something that we thought would not come to our shores, called the war against terrorism. If I could quote from John Kennedy, it's a long twilight struggle. And we never will know quite when it's over. I mean, one of the great ironies in this, when you talk about a war, there's no end to it that you can actually define. There's an enemy you can't readily identify. And so as long as there is instability, as long as there are deep grievances, some of them legitimate, many of them illegitimate, but as long as you have that turmoil out in the world, then with the access to what we call weapons of mass destruction, we have a war which is going to present a real challenge to us. How do we fight such a war? A lot of talk today about using the military to fight the war. We've seen what our military is capable of, certainly in Bosnia, in Kosovo, when I was in service at the Pentagon, but also in Afghanistan. And much of the al-Qaeda network has, in fact, been disrupted, if not destroyed. But now the real issue is, well, where do we go from here? Is it going to be simply combat forces waging this war? And I would submit to you today that military action is probably going to be the least likely form of waging this war in the future. Most of it will come about through police work, sharing of intelligence, covert activity. Warfare itself will not take the form of armed combat for the most part. It will always be there as a last resort. But you're seeing now something take place called the sharing of intelligence and why that's important. The administration, this administration, has gone on record saying you can't play defense 100% of the time. If you're an athlete, whether you're Michael Jordan or Shaquille O'Neal or whoever you happen to be, you can't play defense 100% of the time and expect to win. And so you've got to score at some point and go on the offense. Well, how do you go on the offense against terrorism? Because it's no longer mass armies that are organized hierarchically, but they're diffuse. They're organized along networks as such. And so we have to contend with this kind of warfare in the future. We're going to depend upon countries sharing their intelligence with the United States, with us sharing intelligence with them. Look at the daily papers. Singapore arresting more people in Singapore. Now, there are very few countries that have a greater sense of security than Singapore. Maybe Israel would have a greater sense of intense security interest if you've ever been to Israel. But Singapore is close. You have a small city-state, so to speak. And that city-state is very concerned about their security, and yet they were astonished. They were astonished to find al-Qaeda members in their very midst planning to blow up the U.S. Embassy and attack our sites. Well, now they are doing what? They're cracking down on those cells that have been allowed to function within their small country. Malaysia, the Philippines, Germany, all around the world you're looking at countries who now understand that there's no such thing any longer as the rear lines. Everybody's on the front lines, and this is something that I don't think any of us anticipated until, certainly until recently, that all of us are now vulnerable, here at home or abroad. And that's what weapons of mass destruction do. You may not recall this, but when I was at the Defense Department, I tried to alert the American people to the danger of weapons of mass destruction. We used to say WMD. Dr. Nye and John White and I and Ash Carter will always talk on these acronyms, WMD. But what does it mean? What does a weapon of mass destruction really mean? So I took a 5-pound bag of sugar, and I went on national television, and I said, I want you to assume that in this 5-pound bag of sugar, it's not sugar, but anthrax. And this amount of anthrax released with the right wind conditions, with the right dispersal mechanism, would kill anywhere from 40 to 60% of the population of a city the size of Washington, D.C. So that's 5 pounds. Now I want you to understand there are hundreds of tons of anthrax in existence. So we got a real problem out there. We have a real problem if smallpox is ever released. I could paint scenario after scenario. You don't have to be Stephen King to figure this one out. He wrote a book way back in the 70s called The Stand. And I cite Stephen King because he's from Bangor, and that's my hometown. But think about it. If someone were infected in this room with smallpox deliberately and just went around tonight and just started saying hello to you, shaking your hand, and mixing at the hour here, and then you all go out and see how many people. And just think about it exponentially, how many people you will come into contact with in the next 24 hours. That is the kind of threat that we have to face in the future. Now, how do we combat that? Very difficult. There are no bombs that are going to destroy that. What we have to do is we have to make sure that we continue to reinforce the notion in every other country that we're all in this together, that we have to share whatever information we can. We have to collectively try and break down those walls that are protecting people who are developing weapons of mass destruction. And so it's going to be a very difficult effort, and military itself, the military will play a role, but it will not be the predominant role. It will always be there if you have to use it as a last resort. And I will tell you this, most people in the military, contrary to any popular assumption, they're the last ones that want to go into battle. That is why you've seen such reticence or reluctance on the part of retired generals, General Schwarzkopf. You've seen General Scowcroft. You've seen others, General Zinni, former commander of CENTCOM. You all have seen and said, wait a minute, before we conduct any kind of armed conflict here, let's think about all the potential consequences. It's not an excuse for inaction, but before you take military action, you have to think through all of the contingencies. What can happen? What is likely? How do we have a game plan to cope with that? And so the military, the uniformed military, are the ones who have to do the fighting and the dying. And they're the ones who have been there before. And so they're the last ones that want to go into battle, unless you absolutely have to. They're ready to, and that's what's most inspiring about the people who serve us. If you went out with me on any given occasion, or Dr. White or any of us, and went out in an aircraft carrier in the Persian Gulf during the summer, when the temperature's on the deck of a carrier about 120 degrees, and that's not taking into account the humidity, it's about a combined factor of about 140 degrees. And they've got jets taking off those aircraft carriers, and the heat blast coming from that. And they're wearing ice collars around their neck and ice jackets under their shirts to stay cool. And you know what? They are happy to be out there doing their job. And it's an inspiring thing to see, and we've got to protect that. We've got to make sure that we always take care that when we're going to put our people on the line, their lives on the line, we do it for a cause which we've identified with a mission that is critical, and that we also think about what we call the exit strategy. And I'm going to stop here in a moment and let you get at me with some questions. The one thing that I was frequently asked on Capitol Hill when I was serving as Secretary of Defense, okay, what is the mission in Kosovo? Why are we there? How do you expect to accomplish this through your air campaign? How much will it cost in terms of money, but most importantly, blood? How many people will we lose? How many will we kill? And by the way, Mr. Secretary, what is your exit strategy? How do we get out? And how long will we be there? And will we have to engage in nation building? All of these questions were asked of me every time I went to face my former colleagues. They are good questions. These are questions that a democratic society should demand of their elected officials. Or appointed officials in my case. And so we have to respond to that. This is why we are there. This is what we're expending. This is how many people we're likely to lose. This is how long we will have to be there. This is why we are going to be engaged in, quote, nation building, because it's in our national security long-term interest to be engaged in these affairs. So let me conclude at least my prepared remarks as such, as I've wandered around the landscape. One of the books that I read many years ago that stayed with me was an address by Walter Lippmann, who was a graduate of Harvard, class of 1910, and he gave the address to the 30th reunion of his class. It was in 1940, and he stood in front of the large class that he had at that time. He said, you know something? Every single time our generation, had a tough decision to make, we took the easy way out, every time. He said, following World War I, what did we do? We cut our military dramatically. We started popping the champagne bottles, drinking the bubbly. We indulged in all the excesses, and what happened? There was a mechanized evil loose throughout Europe. He said, and here we are now on the verge of another world war. And he said that this is the standard to which the wise shall now repair. You took the good things for granted, and now you must earn them again. And for every right that you cherish, you've got a duty you must perform. For every hope that you entertain, you have an obligation you must fulfill. And for every good that you wish to achieve, you will have to sacrifice your comfort and your ease, because there's nothing for nothing any longer. Those words were pretty powerful and poignant then. They are applicable today when you think about the gravity of the threat that we are all likely to face in the future unless we can somehow rally a consensus in this country and in the United Nations and throughout the organized world as such, that we have a common interest in preventing the spread of weapons of mass destruction. We have a common interest in finding ways in which we can, to use Dr. Nye's phrase, take advantage not only of our hard power, which there is no peer competitor, but also understand that our soft power is equally and perhaps even more compelling and persuasive, and find ways that we can nurture that and utilize that in ways that are produce peace and prosperity for the rest of the world. Thank you very much.
We now have time for questions. There are 2 microphones on each side of the floor, 2 in the balconies in the middle. Let me remind you, questions should be short, to the point, and they come 1 per customer. And please identify yourself and your relationship to the university as you ask your question. So we'll start with the microphone on the left.
I have to forewarn you, the questions have to be short, but I don't.
Secretary Cohen, my name is Arash Farron. I'm a second year at the business school. Despite recent Iraqi concessions, it seems more and more inevitable that some kind of confrontation with Iraq is likely. My question is, what do you think are the risks the U.S. faces if it's forced to confront the Iraqi threat from a unilateral or bilateral standpoint in the eyes of the world community?
Well, I think that any time we talk about taking military action, we ought to try and do it on a multilateral basis whenever we can. We had sort of a mantra during the Clinton years, which I think is the right one, at least from my perspective. Multilateral whenever you can, unilateral whenever you must. Dr. Nye has given a much more detailed examination of that particular formula. He, as I recall, has 7 steps or 7 tests that one should apply as to when you should act unilaterally or when you must, and under what conditions should you then act in a multilateral fashion. So it's always better, if you can, to have more and more countries join you. It gives you not only greater, well, not always, but gives you usually greater military flexibility, but also higher moral authority. And the more countries that see this particular dictator as an enemy, as someone who does pose a threat with weapons of mass destruction, I think the better off we are. But of course, there are risks involved. If we act bilaterally with our British friends, then it tends to cause us to be at least isolated in the short term, that other countries sitting back, waiting to see how the pieces fall. And to the extent that they don't work exactly as we would like to see them work out, then they can be very quick on the line to criticize and to condemn the United States. So I think President Bush did the right thing. I'm convinced he did the right thing by going to the United Nations saying, please stand behind the existing resolutions. This is the rule of law. If you believe in the rule of law, you will stand behind these resolutions, and collectively you will demand open, uninhibited inspections. With the consequence of failure this time, after we've gone through 10 years of this, the implication being that they will collectively seek his removal and the destruction of the weapons. That is a better course of action if we can achieve it.
I'm Chi Peng Ng from Singapore. I'm a mid-career student here at Kennedy School. Yes, given that even if you have support in the war against Iraq, do you think that attacking Iraq is the best option to rid yourself of a threat of WMD? Or would that actually provoke even more greater acts of terrorism against the United States, whether here or in your interests abroad?
Well, that's a raging debate in this country right now between the administration view and that of others. If you have an imminent threat, if you can, your intelligence, I remember President Bush this summer said a lot will depend upon, if he is to take action or proposes to take action, depend upon intelligence, information. A lot will depend upon the quality of the information that you have in terms of, are the facilities that once were producing biological and chemical or even nuclear weapons being expanded? Is the threat growing in the region? If you have information to that, then that gives you one option, saying, do you wait until it gets bigger and bigger and perhaps more dangerous? But you also have to analyze the issue of, does Saddam have a record of exporting terrorism? We know that he has certainly produced terror on his own people. We know that he has had a 10-year war with Iranians. But generally speaking, he's not known for exporting terrorism as much as, let's say, the Iranians. Now, that's a whole different subject matter tonight about Iran, for example, but Iran poses a greater long-term threat in terms they do have chemicals, they do have biologicals, they are trying to get nuclear weapons, they are testing the Shahab 3. So, but there's something else taking place in Iran. A whole generation, 70% of the people who have been born since the Shah now in Iran want a different life, but they've got the clerics sitting on top of them in another kind of despotic fashion, but they're so-called elected officials. But there's an opportunity in Iran that we perhaps don't have right now in Iraq. So a lot depends on the information that the president has at his disposal. But I think we have to take care. I don't think we can just base it on pure assumption. We assume, I mean, I am satisfied that he has held on to chemical and biological weapons. I have no doubt that he has done that. Do I have proof? The answer is I don't. Do I assume he's been building more weapons of mass destruction? I assume so based on his past conduct. But do I know that? The answer is I don't. So I think that the administration is going to have to satisfy some members of Congress who should ask these questions, hopefully in closed session, saying, tell us what you know that gives us the sense this is imminent, this is a real danger now, because we've got other challenges we have to face as well, and we want to hold, as much as we can, we want to hold other countries together in this war against terror. And we don't want to isolate ourselves. So all of those factors have to go into this, this question about, do we go to war against Saddam, and if so, what form does it take? Frankly, there's no one in the region or outside the region that looks to Iran with any sense of admiration. They all know that, yes, he rules by brutal dictatorship and cruelty. They know that he has been a source of evil in the region. But they're also concerned about instability. Does this unleash forces in other neighboring countries under the circumstances where we don't have a peace, not agreement, a peace process underway really in the Middle East? So there's a lot of concern there right now, and issues have to be raised, questions have to be raised, and the administration will have to answer them as best it can, but it should be based upon intelligence.
Right, Balcony.
Thank you. My name is Florina Lilia. I'm an MPH student here. I'm from Romania. First of all, thank you. It's been an honor to hear you today. My question relates to the same issue, but do you see a role, or a new role for NATO in all this? Or in the foreseeable future, do you see the scope for the creation of a new organization that would also comprise cooperation in civil security?
I don't think we need any more organizations. I think NATO has served all of us well, and NATO will be expanded. I assume you have a vested interest in asking that question. I assume that Romania will be one of the principal candidates for NATO enlargement. NATO, by definition, I think, is changing. Previously, it was a military organization with some social attributes to it, or political attributes. Now it's much more, I think, of a political institution with military attributes. If you look at the philosophy, Tony Blair, I can recall this when we had the Washington summit. He said that NATO, no, it's the summit, I'm sorry, in Spain. He said that NATO is not a social club. And at that point, what he was saying was absolutely correct. The countries that wanted to come into NATO had to be a producer of security, not simply a consumer. That we used to say that the door to NATO was always open, but it's at the top of the very steep set of stairs. So you have to reform your military, you have to have open markets, you have to be a democracy, you have all of these things you must do, and then you can come into NATO. And so the NATO itself, what they talk about now is it is spreading a zone of stability. That NATO membership is no longer so focused on what can you contribute in terms of military armament as such, but what can you contribute in the war against terrorism? What kind of intelligence system can you put together that can help us fight this war? And so it's more evolving into a zone of stability concept as opposed to a strictly military orientation.
Left balcony.
Mr. Secretary, my name is Rod O'Connor. Thank you for being here tonight. I'm a mid-career student. Our effort to combat terrorism has involved both military and law enforcement abroad and to some extent domestically here. I wonder if you could comment more on how you integrate those, what advice you would have for integrating those efforts, and then at home where you draw those lines.
Yeah, I probably should have mentioned this. Thanks for the question. I should have mentioned this when I spoke to you directly. The greatest challenge to us domestically is how do we reconcile the need for security and privacy? I mean, if you look to the government, you say, what is the government's duty? It's to protect you. Whether it's the federal government or the state government or the local government, is to protect the safety and the security of its citizens. So that's a primary obligation. We also have an obligation to protect what? Your privacy, your civil liberties. Well, how do we do that in this new world that we're living in? You've all read Orwell, right? 1984. And what was Orwell's concern? Orwell's concern was that we were going to see more and more power accumulated by a central government that would have all the information it needed on each and every one of you. And therefore, it could say, you would see that the distortion of language was a precursor to a distortion of values. Therefore, war really was peace, that ignorance was wisdom, that slavery was freedom, and that 2 + 2 = 4 or 5 or 6, or whatever the government says it will equal. You remember Winston Smith? He was locked in a room to confront his fundamental fear, which was what? Fear of rats. And so he was prepared to say, whatever 2 + 2, whatever you want it to mean, that's what it will equal. So what we have now is not yet one big Orwell. We have a lot of little Orwells, don't we? They're called credit card companies and banks. I'm serious. Any credit card company knows exactly everything about you. They've done a profile of you. Talk about profiling. They've got a profile of you. They know your birth date, your social security number. They know where you were born, where you went to school. They know what you wear for clothes. They know what you buy for shoes. They know what who you send flowers to, whether you buy candy. They have a profile. And then they make that profile, and then they market it to a lot of other companies, don't they? So that they can sell things to you. Boy, we got a live one over here. We've got someone who's in the category between $20,000 and $30,000 or $300,000 or $400,000, and they start marketing everything to you. So they have lots of little Orwells in our lives. And we don't think too much about it because they're little. And they don't intrude into our privacy too much, although we don't have much left. Now the question is, let's suppose now the federal government has all this information. And the central government is out to, quote, protect you. Now, you've got two interesting debates taking place. Bill Safire on the right and Mr. Dershowitz somewhat on the left. And it's revolving around the issue of identity cards. How many here favor having a national ID card? Raise your hands. Okay. How many here are opposed? Okay. Now, listen to the arguments because they're important and they're going to affect each and every one of us. If you have Alan Dershowitz, I'm not sure he's committed to the national ID card, but he says, well, you know, what do we got to fear? If I'm not a terrorist, I'm not doing anything wrong, and so this information in the hand of the government, so what? Now, I'm not sure he says it quite that bluntly or even subscribes to that, but let me take his case to the extreme. You've got Safire over here on the right says, wait a minute. It may sound good today that we need that card to protect these people from coming into the airports and tracking them, and when their visas expires, we know exactly where they are. Because after all, we've lost control, haven't we, of our borders. We've lost control of our immigration system. We really have become undisciplined. I mentioned that word responsibility and discipline before. So, but he says, let's suppose it's 5 years from now or 10 years from now. It is the natural evolution of any government agency to constantly expand itself. That's the way life is. It constantly expands its power base. So now we have all of this information on you. And now we know where you're living, what you're earning, what you're buying, what car you're driving, et cetera, et cetera. But now perhaps you want to write an op-ed piece and you want to criticize what the government is doing. And suddenly that goes into the central bank, critical of government policies. Now, does that make you a suspect, subject to perhaps at least a knock on the door at night by the police who don't think too much of your activities? That's what Safire is worried about, not today. Because most people say, I have nothing to hide. I'm an innocent citizen. I love this country. I'm not a terrorist, so why not sign up? And you have to remember this. Whatever you give to the government, no matter how noble the purpose, it's going to be tough to get it back. Whatever you give up, you will not get back easily. So we have, as we go through this, and I say this understanding, there could be another terrorist attack any time in this country, and all of these issues will be by the board. But as we have the time to think about it, we ought to think, what are we willing to give up in exchange for more security? How much of our freedom, how much of our privacy are we willing to yield in order to be secure and safe? Because the ultimate obligation of the government to protect you, and as we get closer and closer to the terrorist front lines, which are the rear lines as well, you have to have this balance and this trade-off. What are we willing to trade off? It's a real fundamental issue which all of us, you as students, as citizens, elected officials, and prior officials as such, we all ought to debate this while we have the chance to debate it.
Mr. Secretary, after 9/11, President Bush, Sam Rosen,
ID card, please.
Sorry. Sam Rosen, Senior Corps Member of City Year Boston. After September 11th, President Bush challenged all Americans to do 4,000 years of service, and 4,000 hours of service, which really kind of steps up President Kennedy's challenge, which was to ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. I got that one right? Yeah. What is your view on national service, and how can we use national service to really build America and unify it?
Those in the military who are here, I will tell you this from my own experience, anyone who is a professional military person as such would tell you the all-volunteer Army or military that we have is the finest that we've ever had. If you have people who are volunteers, who want to be there, you have a quality that is a quantum leap above what they've had in the past. Offsetting that argument, of course, is the fact that too many of us are excluded from that public service. Too many think, well, it's just for the middle class, for the most part, to go out there and fight and die for the country. There are many ways to serve this country, and frankly, I think that everybody somehow ought to find a way, whether it's volunteering to help people in a nursing home. I've got a mother-in-law who's quite ill and spent a lot of time there, but seeing the deficiencies that we have in society where people could make contributions on behalf of society rather than simply consuming, I think that would be a great idea. So you could have public service in many ways. It doesn't have to be military service, although I'll tell you, what I've seen in terms of people who have volunteered to go into the military and what they're able to achieve and the futures they have when they leave because of that discipline and because of the leadership qualities they develop, it'd be a worthwhile adventure for all of us. Yes, sir.
Secretary Cohen, my name is Rick Arthur, and I was one of those guys forward deployed out in Asia. My question is, as you mentioned the very tangible benefits of America's place in the world to Asians and you've mentioned the negatives to Americans as far as a high defense budget and those sorts of things. How would you sell the importance that America meets or how would you sell the importance that America meets its commitments as a superpower to disinterested folk in Prescott, Arizona, or Dubuque, who are looking for really tangible benefits of how their money is coming back to them?
Well, you know, one thing, Dan was kind enough to mention my wife, Janet, whom I met years ago. She was had a co-host of a show in Boston called The Good Day Show. But she served alongside of me when I was at the Secretary of Defense position as the First Lady of the Pentagon. The two of us set out to try and remind the American people of what our military was doing on its behalf, on their behalf. And we traveled all over this country, all over the world, pointing out what the military does for our security. What we need to do is to take advantage and remind people. The difficulty is that we've had to shrink down our military. Following the Cold War, following World War II, we've been getting smaller and smaller in the number of people that we have in the military. We've been getting smaller in terms of numbers. We've been getting bigger in terms of obligation. So what's happening in our military? You've got fewer and fewer people carrying out more and more activity. And what's happening? It's like anything else. You can have a fine machine. You keep running it all the time, you will wear it out. You will wear out them, and you will wear out their families. Quality of life becomes a very key issue. So what we wanted to do was to kind of restore the country's understanding of the people who are serving us. As we have gotten smaller and smaller, give you an example, base closures, something we have to do. As we shrink down the number of bases in our society, guess what? People don't see the uniformed military in their society. And when they don't see them, they don't think about them, and they have no appreciation. We tried to involve the mass media. I went to Jerry Bruckheimer, as a matter of fact, and Jerry Bruckheimer has become a very strong supporter of what we were seeking to do. He's the producer of Top Gun, Armageddon, also Black Hawk Down, and I mean, he's just been a great supporter. Steven Spielberg, and others in Hollywood saying, look, we've had a lot of negative portrayals of our military. And we saw that following Vietnam with all the movies that came out really feeding upon the negative characterization of the military. Why don't you start at least looking at the positive side and seeing what the good that they're doing? I mean, if you think about it, worldwide, who are the people that when people are in trouble, who do they call? When there's a tornado or a hurricane or a natural disaster and you have people who are devastated, who do they call? They call the United States. Who do they send? The military. Why? Because they have the logistical base, the aircraft to get them, to bring the cots, to bring the medicines. And so you have the military performing humanitarian missions. When I didn't get into it tonight, but in terms of talking about our strategy, shaping the future out there, but also responding. And John White can tell you this from his work as Deputy Secretary of Defense, and Ash Carter and others, that our military is so admired worldwide in terms of their capabilities because they do everything. They're humanitarians. They're out there helping flood victims. They are also peacekeepers in Bosnia and Kosovo. They are warriors, as you've seen, in Afghanistan. They do it all. And so what we have to do is to somehow get the message out to the American people, and it tends to come in spikes. You're seeing a lot of it now in terms of positive portrayals, but remind them, these are people who are putting their lives on the line for us, and we ought to be paying them more, for one thing, but honoring them more on every occasion that we can.
Secretary Cohen, my name is Joe Pace. I'm a freshman at the college. And you said in your speech, you spoke of being invited by these countries to promote stability, which kind of raises an interesting question. Invited by whom, to promote stability for whom? I mean, are we being invited to promote stability for the puppet regimes that we uphold in the Middle East to ensure the execution of America's agenda? Or are we being invited by the populace to uphold their stability for the populace that these regimes purport to represent? How can you reconcile America's supposed promotion of democracy and tolerance with our history in the Middle East, when we've upheld corrupt governments like the Shah, totalitarian regimes in South America, and turned a blind eye to UN violations of UN resolutions, killing hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children every year?
Okay. The United States has not been certainly consistent in its application of its ideals, to be sure. We've been very pragmatic. And some of that pragmatism takes time to evolve into achieving the ideals that we seek. For example, you mentioned the Middle East. There is change taking place in the Middle East. If you turn to a young man by the name of King Abdullah in Jordan, probably one of the more pro-Western young leaders that we've seen in the region, he's trying to bring about prosperity and even democratic reforms in his own country. But look at Bahrain, look at Qatar, very much in the news today. Qatar is an Arab country. And yet, they not only allow women to drive cars, they allow women to not only vote, but to run for office. Now, 10 years ago, would you have heard of that in any region in the Middle East? The answer was no. So there is change coming, and it's up to us to try and foster that change and to see that it evolves. But you get choices that you really don't like making. For example, would you rather have bin Laden in charge of Saudi Arabia or the royal family? I think the answer is pretty clear right now, even though we want to try to persuade the Saudis that they have to change. If you read Tom Friedman, they've got to change in order to embrace modernity rather than hold back the tides. They can't do it. So how do we balance our own, quote, national security needs with our ideals? We don't always measure up to them. We have, conflicting application of it from time to time. But over the long term, look at what we did in South America. Now, for a number of years, we had absolutely sanctions against South American countries, wouldn't trade with them, wouldn't certainly support them militarily. They've all gone, with the exception of Cuba, from dictatorships to democracies. Now, there's a real danger they could slip back the other way now, but they have spread democracy there. If you look throughout Europe, what is taking place fighting for our ideals? Romania is one, the Czech Republic, now a member of NATO. Look at what's taking place in various parts of the world, and you will see that our application of our ideals there is prevailing. So it takes longer in some instances, and you're quite right to point out that we don't have a consistent application, but that's one of the policy judgments that leaders have to make. How do you reconcile ideals with interests? And sometimes it's not a pretty solution.
Mr. Secretary, my name is Shpend Ahmeti and I come from Kosovo, and it only adds to the pleasure to listen to you tonight. I wanted to go back to what you said about the UN and the fact that, for example, for us in Kosovo, the existence and the importance of the United Nations has become very important the past 2 years, and especially of resolutions of Security Council. Resolution 1244 is like a Bible for us. If the US decides, if it does not have the backup of the Security Council of United Nations for an attack, possible attack on Iraq, what kind of an impact would have that on the United Nations, on its role of Security Council, resolutions in the past and resolutions in the future?
Okay. Let me respond about Kosovo. I was deeply involved in that particular decision making. We had the problem, as you more than anyone else will be familiar with, in terms of Slobodan Milosevic. He was engaged in a campaign of ethnic cleansing. Some might dispute that, but that clearly was the effect of what was taking place as far as the Kosovars were concerned. We tried to rally the NATO countries to support military action if necessary to stop the campaign. Almost all of the NATO countries said, we're not going to do it without a Security Council resolution. It was impossible to get a Security Council resolution because the Russians and the Chinese would object to it and veto it. Therefore, no action being taken. Finally, the European members of NATO saw the consequence if 1 million people were expelled or cleansed from Kosovo, the kind of instability that could create with refugees flooding over into their territories. And collectively they said, we've got to take action. And that was without UN authorization. It was through NATO collectively determining action had to be taken. That was an unusual case as such. Today, I believe it's important, and I argued this for President Bush Sr. and also President Bush 43, that it's important when you talk about going to war. I'm always amazed about this. Whenever I see the conservatives in the Republican Party, my party, want to appoint judges, they want to have strict constructionists. And they're entitled to have strict constructionists of the Constitution. But when it comes time for defining executive power, it becomes very liberal. Namely that the president can do whatever the president wants to do because he's the commander-in-chief. And I don't agree with that. I think that the President of the United States, he has the inherent power to go to war if there is an imminent threat. He suddenly learns we're about to be attacked with more planes being used as missiles. He's got to take action. He has that inherent power to do that. But if you're talking about planning to go to war against another country, then you go back to the Constitution that says Congress declares that. Congress declares war, not the president. We don't have dynasties and we don't have dictatorships. We have democracies. And the framers of the Constitution wanted to make sure that we don't go into war based on a chief executive. We go with the consent of the people. Now, that's my interpretation of the Constitution. But I say, even if you disagree with that, even if you say absolutely you're wrong, politically it's imperative that the president have the support of elected officials. And I will tell you it's a practical matter. Once you start going to war and the bombs start falling and bullets start flying and bodies start coming home, if you don't have members of Congress who are, in effect, they're your board of directors. You are the shareholders. They're your board of directors. If they aren't on board in advance of that war, if things go awry, they'll be going out the door, leaving you right here all by yourself with your military in the field. And no president wants to be in that position, and no military wants to be in that position. So whether you agree constitutionally, that's a political imperative. And President Bush has now responded to that. He's going to the Congress, he's going to the UN. There's still an issue to be resolved in terms of now whether Saddam Hussein, whether he now by raising the white flag again saying come on in, whether that's going to diffuse the issue. But I think it's still incumbent that the president must try, if he can, get the consent of the United Nations Security Council and the United Nations. If he can't, then he has to make a judgment, again, consulting and dealing with the Congress as to whether or not the threat itself is so imminent or so grave that there's no other alternative but unilateral action. I'm told that's the end of my time.
Actually, we do one last question.
Yes, Jules Levine, a Harvard alumnus, was privileged as a Maine citizen to be represented by Senator Cohen. I've been dismayed to hear some members of the President Bush administration say that the Defense Department had insufficient resources and misallocated resources until they came into power, and now they're curing all that. Do you have any response?
We had a great military, we've got a great military, and I hope that the resources that they apply to the Defense Department will be used wisely. But I did try to call attention to the fact, I must tell you, I tried to keep, John and I both, tried very hard to keep the military out of politics. As a Republican in a Democratic administration, to President Clinton's credit, never once did he try to involve me or anyone in the department in any kind of political decision. There was never any wag the dog. There was none then. There's none now. We will never allow the military to be used to achieve a political objective. And so when the criticism started to come that we had a hollow military, I said, wait a minute, we don't have a hollow military. We've got problems, we've got challenges, we've got a smaller force that's being overutilized. And it's the same thing is true today. But they're not hollow, and by the way, it's the same hollow military that you used to carry out the campaign in Afghanistan. So we've got real challenges in terms of keeping good people in and getting more people to come in, but we've got still the finest military on the face of the earth. Can I just conclude tonight?
Sure.
I know we have some students here from Russia, I'm told that we do, and I wanted to tell just one little story as I conclude my remarks.
Members of the Duma are here from Russia.
Good. I have spent time meeting with members of the Duma. I'm not sure that I've met individually with you. But back in 1984, I went to Moscow, and I persuaded Joe Biden, now the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, to come with me. Because I had, with the help of Alton Fry, constructed a concept called the guaranteed build-down. And that was, we were engaged in a nuclear debate. How do you modernize your forces but decrease the numbers? And so we came up with a formula to have more mobile forces that were less vulnerable, but also in lower numbers. In any event, I went over to Moscow to try to persuade the Soviet Academy of Sciences, then designated, that this was a formula that they could use and we could use. I was singularly unsuccessful. They didn't buy it. They thought it was Ronald Reagan's attempt to simply put them in a defensive and inferior position. But while I was there, I had occasion to go out and meet with some of their poets. I met with Yevgeny Yevtushenko, Andrei Vosnesensky, but it was Yevtushenko I spent the afternoon out at his dacha, and he said something that has stayed with me, several things. He is a poet who wrote the poem called Babi Yar. For those of you who have ever read any Russian poetry, go back and read that one. That was the one that really made him most famous. But we finished the afternoon together, and then I was leaving, and he came outside and he said two things. He said, of all the values that we have in your country and our country, they all may change, except there's one value that doesn't change, and that is the value of human kindness. That will not change. And then he said one other thing that is most memorable. He said, you and I, we've got to stay in touch with each other. Otherwise, we will forget each other's faces. And it was a very poetic way of him saying something that's so important in human affairs and in world affairs. We have to stay in touch with each other, because if we don't have contact with each other, whatever the country may be, whatever the contest may be, then we tend to forget the faces. We tend to, in a time of crisis, demonize the other people, and then rush into conflict. And so the more that we stay in touch with each other, the more that we put faces on countries and peoples, the chances of us going off into conflict in the future are seriously reduced. So if there's one thing that the Kennedy Institute can do, it is to help you come into contact with people from other countries and to study their faces and make sure you stay in touch with them when you leave. That will be the best way for us to promote peace in the world to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Secretary Cohen will tell him he's always welcome back and adjourn for the evening. Thank you.
I don't know. Well, we just wait for. What did he say? It's over there. All along. We had a very, very good intro to Secretary England the other day. I tell you, I don't know how much preparation, but you did great.